Imagine this picture. A boundless icy wasteland, minus 40 degrees, and you suddenly come face to face with one of probably the largest predators on the planet, a polar bear. And in such a situation, without modern weapons, the chances of survival are, well, according to sources, less than 10%. Yes, and this, you know, is not an exaggeration at all. Many people think that polar bears are something from documentaries, you know, such detached animals that avoid humans. But the reality is that a hungry, or, let us say, provoked bear is an incredibly intelligent and efficient predator. There, in its environment, it is the absolute apex of the food chain. And yet, here is what is astonishing. For millennia, the indigenous Inuit people did not merely survive. They thrived, living literally side by side with these creatures. Today we are diving right into their remarkable survival strategies, and they are based not on strength, but on the deepest knowledge of the surrounding environment. Absolutely right. We will examine how this subtle understanding of bear psychology, architecturally ingenious solutions in my opinion, and most importantly, collective responsibility, allowed the Inuit to achieve this fragile balance. This story is not so much about struggle as about the coexistence of two intelligent species in one territory. Well then, let us begin with the scale of what was happening. To understand the genius of their methods, one probably needs to grasp how often their paths actually crossed, where and how the Inuit encountered polar bears in their everyday lives. Well, they essentially shared one home, the Arctic. According to modern estimates by biologists, between 22,000 and 31,000 polar bears inhabit the region, and the greatest concentration, about 16,000 individuals, falls precisely in the Canadian Arctic. This is their primary kingdom, their territory for hunting and breeding. And in this same kingdom in Canada, approximately 65,000 Inuit live. They live in about 50 communities scattered across the entire region, and many of these settlements are located precisely where it is most convenient for bears to hunt seals. That is, these are not some rare chance encounters once a year, but constant proximity, a daily reality. It is precisely this daily reality for many families. Just look at the statistics, which simply stagger the imagination. In the territory of Nunavut alone, the largest region of Canada, between 300 and 8,000 encounters per year between people and bears are officially recorded. Just think about that. Up to 8,000 encounters? That is an incredible figure. Yes, exactly so. Just think about it. In the worst case, that is more than 20 encounters every single day in just one region, and that is only what has been officially documented. The real number of encounters may be even higher, because many Inuit simply do not report every encounter with a bear. It is an ordinary part of life for them. 8,000 is simply mind-boggling. And are there any examples of specific settlements where the situation is particularly tense? Yes, of course there are. For example, the settlement of Arviat on the coast of Hudson Bay. There, local residents say that during snowless seasons, they see bears near their homes at least once a week, and sometimes more often. This is already almost cohabitation on the same territory, you understand? A bear can simply walk past your window while you are having dinner. And what is most alarming, the situation seems to be only getting worse with each passing year. Our materials state that due to the melting of Arctic ice, bears are spending more and more time on land, forced to remain where people live. If in the 1980s, a certain community reported 20 to 30 encounters per year, today, that same community may face hundreds of encounters. That is a colossal increase in danger over a relatively short period. Without a doubt, the numbers are growing year after year. And this makes the traditional knowledge we are discussing today not just some cultural heritage from the past, but, well, literally a matter of life and death for modern generations. Their relevance today is possibly even greater than 100 years ago, when there was more ice and bears less frequently approached human settlements. Good. That is truly impressive. And this brings us to the main question of our entire conversation. How did they manage this for centuries without powerful, large-caliber rifles, without electric fences, without modern means of communication and helicopters? What was their main secret of survival? The fundamental basis of their strategy was their attitude toward the bear. They perceived the bear, which they called Nanook, not as a soulless killing machine, not as a monster from nightmares, but as another intelligent being that has its own habits, its own intellect, its own weaknesses and behavioral characteristics. They treated it with enormous respect, but without the panicked fear that paralyzes. This allowed them to analyze the situation. That is, instead of building walls higher and higher, hoping simply to wall themselves off from danger, they tried to understand what was happening in the bear's mind. What drove it, what it wanted, how it thought. Exactly so, and this is not just philosophy or beautiful words. This is pure practice, developed over centuries of observation. By understanding the behavioral patterns of the bear, its habits and instincts, the Inuit could predict its next actions. And their first and most important line of defense was early detection of the threat. Noticing the bear before it notices you is half the battle. And for this, they used observation techniques that, honestly, sound almost like magic to a modern person. For example, reading the wind. This is not just licking your finger and holding it up, right? Not at all simple, no. This was an entire science, passed down from father to son over generations. A hunter could, yes, moisten his finger with saliva and raise it up. Or, what was even more subtle and precise, he would take a handful of very light, fluffy snow and throw it onto the ground, observing where this ground-level, almost invisible airflow would carry it. This way, they detected the slightest movements of air masses and the scents they carried. One of the elders in our sources recalled how his father could, in this way, detect the presence of a bear at a distance of more than 2 kilometers. Can you imagine? 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers is an incredible distance. That is almost super sensitivity and tracks in the snow. In the sources, there is an excellent phrase. Snow for them was like a newspaper they read every day. A wonderful analogy, very accurate. They truly read it the way we read a news feed. The depth of a paw print told them about the weight and size of the bear. One could understand whether it was a male or female, an old animal or a young one. The distance between tracks told about the speed of movement and the animal's intentions, whether it was hurrying or wandering unhurriedly. And the route itself, the trajectory of movement, told about its current state and goals. If the tracks go in a straight line, it means the bear is hungry and purposefully hunting. It has a target. If it zigzags from side to side, most likely it is well fed, simply patrolling its territory, exploring the surroundings. This gave a clear understanding of whether one needed to leave that place immediately or could continue onward, but with heightened caution and attention. But perhaps the most astonishing thing I read in the materials is the ability to distinguish types of bear breathing by sound. This already sounds like something completely supernatural, almost mystical. How close did one need to get to the animal to hear this? That is an enormous risk to one's life. Yes, this is indeed the highest level of observational skill and mastery. We are talking, of course, about situations when the bear was already quite close to the person, perhaps 20 to 30 meters away. Perhaps in the pitch darkness of the polar night, when visibility was zero and sound became the main guide. They learned to distinguish calm, even breathing through the nose. This is simply a curious animal that does not yet see you as either a threat or prey. Rapid, almost whistling breathing meant a frightened bear, And this is also dangerous because a frightened animal is unpredictable. And deep, guttural breathing with growling was already an unmistakable sign of preparation for attack. The bear was ready to strike. And yes, being so close is an enormous risk. But knowledge of this language of sounds gave precious seconds to choose the right tactic. Freeze and not move, slowly back away, or prepare to repel an attack. It is astonishing that this is not simply ancient folklore or legends. The sources mention that modern polar bear researchers, scientific biologists, have begun incorporating some of these traditional observation methods into their own safety protocols when working in the field. And this, I believe, is the best proof of their real effectiveness in practice. Sometimes millennia of observational experience and the accumulated wisdom of generations turns out to be more reliable than any modern GPS tracker or electronic motion sensor. Technology is good, but human experience is priceless. Good. The methods of threat detection are clear. That is impressive. But how did they act preemptively to avoid an encounter altogether? After all, the polar bear's sense of smell is its true superpower, its main weapon. 30 kilometers to detect the scent of a seal under a thick layer of ice. How can one possibly hide from such an incredibly sensitive nose? The answer is very simple, and at the same time difficult to execute. There is no way to hide. Hiding from such a sense of smell is a completely futile endeavor. It is like trying to hide from the wind. Therefore, the Inuit did not hide from scents, but learned to manage what the bear could detect, to control the scent trail. Scent management. That was the cornerstone of their everyday defense against predators. And how specifically did this look in their daily life? What were the rules? It was an entire well-thought-out system of taboos and rules that were observed without exception. Rule number 1, taught from childhood. Never, under any circumstances, store food near the dwelling where people sleep. Special caches and storage sites were built far from the main camp and always on the downwind side, so that the wind would carry the scent in the opposite direction from the living quarters. The caches themselves were often built on high ice platforms or pillars of stones, so that it would be simply physically difficult and inconvenient for a bear to reach them. It would have to climb upward. And the process of cooking food, after all, the smell of fried or boiled meat carries for many kilometers across the icy wasteland. It is a real magnet for a hungry predator. Absolutely right. And for this, there were separate special kitchens, small snow structures located at a distance from the main igloo where the family lived. They necessarily had a cleverly designed ventilation tunnel that directed all the smoke and the smell of cooking food as far as possible from the living area, dispersing it. And there was one absolutely ingenious trick, a little secret. Dry Arctic moss or certain herbs were periodically thrown into the fire. The smoke from burning moss has a very sharp, specific smell, almost acrid. It excellently masked the appetizing aromas of cooking food, throwing the bear off the scent. One wise elder said this phrase in an interview: "You must be smarter than the bear's nose." In my opinion, this perfectly describes their entire approach to survival, their entire philosophy of coexistence. I absolutely agree with you. And this philosophy of cunning and intelligence extended to literally everything, including the architecture of their dwellings. We are all accustomed to thinking that an igloo is simply a shelter from the Arctic cold, a dome of snow. But in reality, it was also a true little fortress, thought through to the smallest detail. So its design originally had a defensive function of protection from predators as well. I always thought that the dome shape was simply the most structurally stable architectural form against wind and snow. It is a stable form, yes, you are right. But it was so incredibly strong, thanks to a special method of laying compressed, dense snow, that it could easily support the weight of an adult polar bear, which weighs from 400 to 700 kilograms. A bear could stand on the dome, and it would not collapse. But the most important, most ingenious element of protection was the design of the entrance to the dwelling. The entrance tunnel into the igloo was always made very low, literally waist-high for a person, and quite narrow. An adult person could squeeze inside, crawling on all fours or almost on their belly. But for an enormous, broad-shouldered bear with its massive body, squeezing inside through such a narrow passage was practically physically impossible. The geometry simply would not allow it. So it turns out to be ingenious. The dwelling itself became a kind of trap for the bear, the narrow neck of a bottle. And the placement of entire settlements, were those also chosen with this constant threat in mind? Of course, everything was carefully thought through by the elders. The site for a camp was chosen so that the prevailing wind in that area would carry all scents away from the camp in the direction opposite from known bear trails and bear hunting grounds. They studied the windrows, observed for months. Everything was calculated and thought through based on years of observing nature. Scent management, well-designed dwelling architecture. But how did they know that a bear had already approached close to the camp, especially in the pitch darkness of the polar night, which lasts for months? Surely someone constantly had to stand guard, keeping watch all night long? Not exactly. That would have been too exhausting. They had, well, simply a brilliant natural alarm system, very simple and reliable. Around the dwellings along the perimeter, they created special pathways of very densely packed snow. You could say they trampled it down to a state almost like ice. In the severe Arctic frost, such compressed snow produces a very loud and distinctive crunch, a creak under the heavy paw of a large animal. It is impossible not to hear. And even more than that, this was truly fine work. The density of the snow compaction could be made different in different places, creating zones with different sounds, and an experienced person, lying in the warmth of their igloo, could determine with complete accuracy, simply by the character of the sound, by the timbre of the crunch, from which exact side of the dwelling the uninvited guest was approaching, north, south, east, or west. All these methods of prevention were aimed at avoiding a direct encounter, preventing contact. But as I understand from the materials, they could not work in 100% of cases. There are always exceptions. What happened when a confrontation with an enraged bear became unavoidable, when there was nowhere to retreat? Then real weapons and specially trained sled dogs came into play. And the hunter's main primary weapon was not simply an ordinary spear for hunting seals, but a special bear spear called a tuluk, created specifically for combat with a large predator. This is, without the slightest exaggeration, a true work of engineering art and ingenuity. What was so special about it? How did it differ from an ordinary spear? First of all, carefully selected materials. The shaft, about 2 meters long, was made exclusively from driftwood, timber washed ashore by the sea onto the Arctic coast. It is very strong yet flexible, resilient, and most importantly, it does not become brittle and does not break in severe frost of -40, unlike ordinary fresh wood. The tip was carved from walrus tusk because it is much harder than ordinary bone from reindeer or whale. It was sharpened to razor blade sharpness, and special barbs were made along the edges so that it would penetrate deeper into the body and lodge there. But the cleverest thing about the design, as I understood from the sources, was its modular, detachable system for connecting the parts. Tell us more about that. This is precisely where all the genius of the ancient craftsmen lay. The tip was not rigidly and permanently fixed to the shaft, glued or bound fast. It was inserted into a special socket at the end of the shaft, but at the same time was connected to the shaft itself by a long, strong strap made of thick sealskin or walrus sinew. Imagine the situation. The hunter delivers a powerful blow into the bear's body, driving in the tip. The bear, in wild fury and pain, grabs the shaft with its powerful paws, trying to wrench it away. If the spear had been a single monolithic piece, the hunter would have instantly lost his only weapon. The bear would have simply torn it away. And with such a clever design, what happened? With the tip on a strap, the hunter could simply release, throw down the shaft at the critical moment. The sharp tip remained deep in the body of the enraged bear, continuing to wound it, while the long shaft, connected by the strap, began to drag behind the animal across the snow, tangling in its legs. This seriously hindered the bear from moving quickly, from pursuing the hunter. It stumbled, caught on the ice, and this gave the hunter a precious chance either to regroup, to prepare a second weapon, or simply to flee while the bear struggled with the shaft. This ingenious design feature saved countless, enormous numbers of lives over the centuries. And what role exactly did the sled dogs play in defense? They were not simply a means of transport for pulling sleds, correct? Dogs of the husky breed were an absolutely integral, critically important part of the entire settlement defense system. They were simultaneously a system of early warning about approaching danger and active physical protection of people. Puppies from a very early age were specially trained not to fear bears, not to flee and panic. When a white predator appeared near the camp, the dogs instinctively, at the command of the pack leader, would form a wide semicircle in front of the bear, surrounding it. They would raise a deafening, piercing bark, creating a wall of sound, lunging at the enormous animal, biting at its hind legs and rump, diverting its attention. This greatly distracted and disoriented the bear. It could not concentrate on the hunters, giving the people precious time to take aim, to hurl a spear or harpoon. One respected tribal elder even recalled in an interview that his pack leader, an experienced dog, could unerringly distinguish a male bear from a more dangerous female with newborn cubs by scent alone, carried on the wind. And it barked differently, with different signals, warning people about the type of threat and its level. So this was not some static, frozen system of defense, but a constantly adapting, living survival strategy. And as I understand from the materials, it changed very significantly depending on the time of year and the season. Without a doubt, absolutely right. The Arctic is an environment with extreme seasonal changes in conditions, and people's behavioral strategies were equally flexible and changeable. Spring, for example, was traditionally considered the most dangerous time of year for people. It was even called by a special term, the time of hungry shadows, the time of awakening. Why was spring considered the most dangerous of all? It would seem that the sun returns after the long night, it gets warmer, life awakens. That is precisely why it was dangerous. At this time, mother bears with tiny newborn cubs emerge en masse from their winter dens after months of hibernation. They are physically exhausted by hunger, weakened by giving birth, and incredibly, lethally aggressive, protecting their offspring from any potential threat. Male bears also emerge very hungry after winter, desperately searching for any food. During this critical period, the Inuit tried to travel across the tundra only in very large groups, 10 to 15 people, and only during the brightest hours of the short day, avoiding twilight. And in summer, the Arctic ice actively melts, and bears come ashore en masse to exactly the same places where human settlements are traditionally located. This creates a new, very serious point of conflict of interests, an overlap of territories. Therefore, summer temporary hunting camps were often deliberately moved inland, farther from the dangerous coastline. People themselves intentionally changed their diet, switching to different game, so as not to unnecessarily cross paths in the same places with their main competitor for food. In autumn, as I understand it, bears become dangerous again, actively putting on fat before hibernation? Yes, absolutely correct. This is a time of intense feeding before the long winter, but the Inuit were always perfectly prepared for this seasonal surge in activity. They created a kind of detailed risk maps of the territory, marking the most dangerous zones with tall, conspicuous pyramids of stones called inukshuks. And they maintained detailed oral bear calendars, passing from generation to generation precise information about where and when bears most often appeared and at what time of day. And in winter, during the long polar night, when for months you cannot see anything around you at all? In winter, people relied on completely different heightened senses, not on sight. They navigated practically by touch, literally reading the structure of ice and the density of snow underfoot and beneath sled runners, the way blind people read Braille. And they set up winter camps very cleverly. They chose locations next to large areas of particularly hard, monolithic sea ice. Such ice works as a natural acoustic resonator, amplifying and carrying the sound of heavy footsteps of an approaching large animal over a great distance. So it turns out that not a single one of these numerous techniques by itself, in isolation, was a 100% panacea for all troubles. The true secret of successful survival lay in their skillful combination, the right blend. And, as it seems to me, in the critically important fact that all of this was the work not of one heroic individual, but of the entire community, the entire tribe. You have captured the very essence, the heart of the entire system, absolutely precisely. This was indeed collective survival, a shared endeavor. The phenomenal success of the Inuit in their confrontation with nature is a true triumph of social organization, not of individual heroism. Even their permanent settlements were originally designed and built with the collective safety of all inhabitants in mind. Igloos were often deliberately arranged in a proper circle or semicircle, so that there were no dangerous blind spots in the field of view, and everyone could see their neighbor. On the periphery of the circle, at the maximum distance from the center, they placed storehouses for food and hides. And play areas for small children and adolescents, on the contrary, were always in the very center of the settlement, in the most protected and safest place under supervision. Very interesting. And how exactly did they alert one another about sudden danger in an emergency situation? Surely just shouting with your voice into an Arctic blizzard and the roar of the wind is completely useless. The sound would never carry. An excellent, very apt question. Over centuries, an entire well-thought-out system of auditory and visual danger signals was created and refined. Most often, to transmit an alarm signal, they used special large drums covered with tightly stretched seal skin. The low-frequency booming sound of a strike carries very far through dense, cold air, for kilometers. And this was not simply chaotic noise to attract attention. Different rhythms of strikes, different combinations carried completely different specific information. It was a true code. 3 quick, sharp strikes in a row meant a bear has been spotted in the distance on the horizon. Everyone be on alert. Keep watch. And a continuous, rapid drum roll without pauses meant mortal danger right at the camp. Everyone immediately to shelters. Grab your weapons. And this entire incredibly complex system of vitally important knowledge had to be effectively passed on to the next generations of children. Sources say that small children were deliberately not frightened with scary stories, but were methodically taught survival through fun games. This is a radically different pedagogical approach to upbringing. Yes, and this is perhaps the most important, key element of their entire culture of survival. Instead of intimidating a child with phrases like, "Do not go there, it is dangerous," or "Do not do this," they turned the teaching of critically important skills into an exciting game, a competition. Adult hunters would make artificial fake tracks of various animals in clean snow, and children eagerly competed with one another to see who could recognize them faster and more accurately, and identify the species of the animal. They played determine the wind direction against the clock and learned to distinguish alarm drum signals flawlessly by ear. This formed not merely abstract theoretical knowledge in the mind, but a deep, instinctive, automatic reaction to any threat that remained for an entire long life. Exactly. These were not boring, formal safety lessons once a month. Vitally important knowledge about survival in the harsh Arctic was naturally woven into the very fabric of every person's daily life from birth. Safety was not a heavy obligation or a burden, but a completely natural, organic part of existence, like breathing. When you put all these elements together, a deep understanding of the psychology and behavior of wild nature, ingenious technologies and tools, the capacity for rapid adaptation, and a powerful social structure of mutual aid, it becomes absolutely clear that their phenomenal success lay not at all in an attempt to dominate nature by brute force, but in the patient ability to listen, observe, and deeply understand the surrounding world. Their ancient wisdom is a most important reminder to us that accumulated knowledge and understanding of the laws of nature are far, incomparably more important than simple brute physical strength or the most modern weapons. Absolutely true and fair. Their centuries-old unique experience convincingly demonstrates that peaceful coexistence between humans and wild nature is entirely possible and achievable, if at the foundation of the relationship lies a sincere striving for deep knowledge rather than senseless violence and destruction. And this wise lesson today, when contacts between civilization and wild nature are becoming ever more frequent and tense, is more relevant than ever before in history. And in conclusion of our conversation, here is an important thought for serious reflection by everyone. In our modern world, where technology seems to separate us more and more from living nature, isolating us in boxes, what important lessons can and should we learn from an ancient culture whose successful survival for many centuries directly depended on the deepest spiritual and practical connection with the surrounding harsh environment? What critically important signals from our own rapidly changing world, whether ecological warnings or social challenges, have we, perhaps, already gradually forgotten how to read and understand correctly?